Remember two great cities in a distant foreign land, when scorched from the face of earth their power of Japan. Be careful, my dear brother, don't take away the joy, but use it for the good of man and never to destroy. Atomic power was given by the mighty hand of God. Atomic power, it was given by the mighty hand of God.
And the Buchanan Brothers, Atomic Power. Welcome to The Torch. I'm Paul DiRienzo, and we have another great show for you in the next hour. We're going to be talking to Tom Carpenter of the Hanford Challenge, and later on Don Hancock of the Southwest Research and Information Center. We're going to be discussing nuclear waste, everybody's favorite subject, and also the search. Maybe we'll get off onto the sort of what we know about the circumstances of the what potentially is a new nuclear arms race that might have been started by some statements by our President Trump. President Trump has made several statements during the campaign that he seemed to be, and it's hard to say from his tweets, but he seemed to be in favor of restarting the arms race, of developing new nuclear weapons and upending literally decades of treaties. And so maybe we'll talk a little bit about the implications of some of the things the president has said about nuclear power and nuclear energy. We'll also maybe talk a little bit about global warming and how that relates. Maybe is nuclear the so-called clean alternative that it was supposed to be? Again, this is The Torch. I'm Paul DiRienzo. You can reach me at PDiRienzo, at PDERIENZO on Twitter. And you can also at PDERIENZO, again, just in case. And as well, we're here at 1 p.m. every Sunday afternoon on the Progressive Radio Network, PRN.FM. So welcome. Our first guest, Tom Carpenter, is the executive director of the Hanford Challenge. He brings decades of experience in organizing, litigating, and policy oversight in the nuclear field, much of it devoted to a place called Hanford. And we'll learn more about Hanford on the Columbia River in Washington State, where one of the major facilities in developing the atomic bomb in the 1940s and later during the Cold War in the 1950s, before it was shut down, but is although mostly, and we'll talk more about that, decommissioned, is in the midst of the largest nuclear cleanup in history, it seems. So Tom Carpenter worked as the director of the Nuclear Oversight Campaign for the Government Accountability Project, and he founded the Cincinnati Alliance for Responsible Energy and challenged plans to open the defect-ridden Zimmer nuclear power plant. He's also served on the Cincinnati Mayor's Environmental Advisory Council. Through his work at GAP and Hanford Challenge, Tom has visited dozens of nuclear sites in the U.S. and Russia, hosted international conferences on protecting nuclear whistleblowers, and examining the legacy of the highly contaminated nuclear facilities and focusing on the Hanford nuclear site in southeastern Washington State. Welcome to The Torch, Tom Carpenter.
Hey, thanks for having me, Paul.
It's great to have you. Let me begin by asking you maybe to describe Hanford. What is Hanford for folks who haven't heard it, and it always never ceases. It doesn't surprise me any longer, really, to find out how few people know about Hanford, Washington, and the role it's played in American history and its current role. What is your role in relation to Hanford? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, sure. Well, to begin with, Hanford is one of the key facilities that was used by the U.S. government to make nuclear weapons. And that actually started with the first plutonium nuclear test, the first nuclear test ever in the desert of New Mexico. And that was the Trinity test. And so the plutonium from that test came from Hanford. And then subsequently, the plutonium used in the Nagasaki bomb was also from the Hanford site. And Hanford went on to become the primary supplier of plutonium for the nuclear weapons arsenal, which reached to, an estimated tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. I read a figure 65,000 at one point. I don't know if it's that high, but there's a lot of plutonium made at the Hanford site. And to make it, you have to, have reactors. Hanford had 9 reactors. You have to dissolve the fuel and tease out the plutonium, and it leaves behind an enormous legacy. So Hanford quit making the plutonium largely because we had so much of it in 1989 and went into a formal kind of cleanup mode. And we've been in that mode since 1989, but haven't made much progress in dealing with what is now largely known as the nation's most contaminated facility and certainly one of the world's top 10.
Mm-hmm. And there's an active cleanup going on there right now of sorts.
Yeah, there's an active cleanup going on. There's 9,000 people employed.
9,000 people, that's a little more than sweeping the floor. There's a lot of cleaning up if 9,000 people are involved, right?
Well, there is. However, progress on the main part of what needs to happen, which is emptying these very large underground nuclear tanks of their highly radioactive contents, and then mixing that into a form that will keep humanity safe for the hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years necessary, is that plan is bogged down. So, unless we clean up the tank waste and what's leaked out of these tanks, then it almost doesn't matter what the rest of the site cleanup has been. Right. Because it will just all recontaminate, and eventually these tanks will explode or catch on fire and disseminate radioactivity throughout the environment. And just not to put too fine a point on it, we've got 2/3 of the nation's high-level nuclear waste stored at the Hanford site and tanks that were mostly built in the 1940s and 50s. So most of the 177 tanks are already, 60 years, 70 years old. 28 of them are newer tanks built in the 1970s, and those are the double shell tanks, and even those have started to give way at this point. And we don't really have a solution yet in place to empty these tanks and start protecting the river and the public around these sites.
Do those tanks represent all the waste that was produced at Hanford during its operations for, I guess, almost half a century?
Yeah, mostly. I mean, a lot of plutonium has been sent off-site for storage at Savannah River, for instance. But mostly Hanford has actually not only been taking its own waste and storing it, but other sites' waste as well, which makes it the largest nuclear dump in the country, and it's in Washington State, about 200 miles southeast of Seattle.
Okay, and I want to go more. The history is so fascinating. I want to go more to that, but without spending, we'll come back to that because I want to really focus now on what's been happening recently, because I know that Hanford Challenge works very closely with the labor unions and the workers at Hanford, and there have been a lot of complaints about failures in the current cleanup that you just described. There have been leaks. Workers have breathed in some of these toxic fumes, at least according to reports. Are those accurate?
Yeah, and actually they're probably understated. So the scope of this issue, I mean, it goes back decades. And so imagine a big, these underground tanks that can hold up to 1 million gallons each. And they're very dynamic, lots of radiation, lots of chemicals. And, when I say dynamic, it's like some of these tanks are very hot of their own accord, self-boiling in the past, and they create vapors and gases. And since these tanks are underground, they've got, anywhere from 15 to 24 openings to the surface. And workers are up there doing things necessary to keep these tanks from blowing up and taking their temperature and transferring waste from one tank to another as all part of the cleanup, but also part of the babysitting program. And the Hanford site, the management there...
Did you say babysitting?
Yeah, they're babysitting these tanks.
Right.
I mean, they're making sure that they don't have a tantrum and then have a bad day for a 3-state region of the United States. It's very important work that they're doing, and these vapors, they're not being protected when they breathe these vapors in until recently. And what was happening was workers would inhale these chemicals and these vapors. Studies have shown that there are thousands of chemicals potentially in these vapors, and they know that many of these chemicals are incredibly harmful. There's almost zero, exposure limits for some of these chemicals.
Sure.
So
they're that poisonous. They're deadly poisons.
They're deadly poisonous. Some of them they can cause cancer, neurological problems. Dimethylmercury is so toxic. It's one of the most toxic chemicals out there. These tanks emit them, and workers breathe them in. And other mercury compounds and nitrosodimethylamine, which is NDMA, and it's such a tiny acceptable exposure level, and they don't even monitor for these chemicals in many cases.
Really?
So workers are getting sick, and in the last 10 years, not even 9 years, I guess, there have been over 480 workers have had medical evaluations at their request because of these exposures. Making them feel bad in some cases, and in other cases, these people get really sick. And so there have been a few deaths resulting, from these exposures. There have been numbers of workers who have come down with brain damage, basically toxic encephalopathy, lung damage, etc. So, we've been, as a group, Hanford Challenge, which is a group I started and head up. We're trying to advocate for a safe and effective cleanup, and working with the workforce is very important. Protecting their health and safety is very important.
I see. Now, there was a story of a number of whistleblowers who came forward that Hanford Challenge defended, I think, and who lost their jobs because they started to tell inside stories about some unsafe practices that were going on inside of Hanford and how they were treated as whistleblowers.
Yeah, well, there have been hundreds of whistleblowers. I mean, literally hundreds of whistleblowers at the Hanford site in my tenure. I've been working on this site since 1988 and represented many of them. And I think most of these cases, once they're filed, we've won a number, we've settled a bunch, and lost very few. And so I'm a lawyer and do that. We also have staff attorneys. The most recent spate, basically, of retaliation had to do with the design of a plant that was supposed to be designing and constructed to handle the high-level waste out of these tanks, to turn that waste into glass, basically.
Glassification?
Yeah, glassification. And it's not a bad idea. We support the idea of doing that. However, the design of the facility was faulty. And a number of very high-level technical people came forward with disclosures. We're talking top managers who are also chemical engineers, nuclear safety engineers, and other kinds of folks like that, the chief scientist. And they revealed that if you were to operate this plant as was designed, then you are risking hydrogen gas buildup and explosions, nuclear criticalities because of the buildup of plutonium in the system.
That enough plutonium, if it's just next to each other, could self-detonate as a sort of a nuclear explosion of sorts.
Yeah, it's called a nuclear criticality. It's the release of a lot of energy, and in confined spaces, and if you have enough of it, you can have an explosion, or it could just be a big release of neutron and heat. These plants were not designed to handle this kind of incident. And it all came down to the way the plant was designed. And instead of these engineers getting thanked for bringing out this problem so it could be fixed, they were terminated from their jobs and went on to have court battles. They testified in the Senate several times. We made sure their information got out far and wide, and they won the battle over the safety of the plant. So the Secretary of Energy at the time came out to the site. What's going on here? I'll solve this. And he ended up shutting down the plant, the construction and the design, and said, you got to fix this before you can, proceed. But nothing happened for these whistleblowers, basically. They had to keep fighting. They weren't reinstated. and it was a resounding message to all the other workers that you think you can't be touched. Look at what we did to these top management figures up here. So it was a great message to all the workers to keep your lips zipped. Don't raise safety concerns. A very, very effective, strategy on the part of the companies, and unfortunately, the Department of Energy supported all of this.
Right. That's what I was going to ask Tom Carpenter of Hanford Challenge, who's been discussing the problems at this Hanford nuclear site, which is involved in this massive cleanup. And I was going to ask, and you just mentioned, I think that I was going to ask, is the federal government or the private contractors, are they the source of these problems with the workers?
Yes.
Oh.
So, I mean, they kind of operate hand in glove. They're best buddies. And part of that's because senior DOE managers and even mid-level, they've got retirement jobs waiting for them over in the contractor community, and they're going to make 4 times their salary, just in a day, basically doing consulting if they're nice to the contractor. It's called a deferred bribe. That's how I look at it. And so they're very friendly and cozy over at the Department of Energy with these contractors. And so they cover things up. They support the termination of these whistleblowers. They take no action, even though they win their cases and settle their cases. One of the individuals, Dr. Walt Tanasitis, 40 years, PhD, 40 years with DuPont in the industry, chemical engineer, and so this guy gets fired, fights his case. It takes him 3.5 years, settles it for $4.3 million. Of course, the company says, well, we didn't do anything, but here's $4.3 million. Excuse me. But then he went on to also file a False Claims Act case alleging fraud by the contractor against the government. And again, that was settled by Bechtel and another company called URS, and they, between them, paid $125 million in settlement fees, again, not admitting that they did anything wrong.
Considering that the potential disaster that could occur here, what are they gaining by putting off an expense that could balloon down the road if there was a disaster to billions of dollars?
Well, my own personal theory is they have little intention of actually opening this plant. And so they're using it as a cash cow, or as you will, an ATM in the desert. Mm-hmm. It's so badly designed. It's so poorly constructed. It is so riddled with issues that it probably would be cheaper at this point just to tear it all down and start from scratch with a new set of contractors and a new oversight agency other than the Department of Energy.
Meanwhile, 50-plus million gallons of highly toxic radioactive waste sits in 177 leaky tanks?
Leaking tanks, yep. So, you've got an opening date now planned for the waste treatment plant to glassify the waste of 2036, so 20 years away. This plant was started in 2000. The year 2000 was supposed to be open and producing glass in 2011. And obviously we didn't do that, and we're still on the same plant. The GAO estimated last year that we spent $19 billion on waste treatment at the Hanford site for this waste, with not one spoonful of waste taken care of. So Hanford is pretty much in the same relative position it was in 1989 when the cleanup started when it comes to the high-level nuclear waste.
But $20 billion later.
Right, and now we're looking at maybe another $125 billion for the cleanup at the Hanford site to spend into the future, although the GAO just did a study and said, well, that's probably low. Well, yeah, it's always been low, right? So it's we're kind of caught in this nightmare. I think what Hanford really wants to do is simply pour concrete into the tanks, which would last maybe 20 years or 40 years, and then the concrete would fail, but, they're gone. So essentially, that's what I think that
pushing
where
the
we're
problem to future generations. Is there a connection with the waste isolation pilot plant? I know I was just reading a few headlines that there was an attempt to ship waste down there or back from there. I know that plant has been closed in New Mexico because of a disaster that occurred at this waste dump. Is that involved with Hanford now?
Yeah, it's Hanford is scheduled to send a lot of plutonium and plutonium-contaminated waste, which the industry calls transuranic waste, or TRU. But mostly, you're talking plutonium, and it was scheduled to go to I think it's like 80,000 barrels are supposed to go to WIPP, something like that, some large number. And it's been closed because of an explosion that they said could never happen, and it would never get contaminated down there, et cetera. So they're struggling to open that site. And now there's some talk of sending Hanford tank waste also to the WIPP facility. It's not designed for that. They made specific legal commitments to the state of New Mexico that they wouldn't do that. But hey, the government changes its mind all the time. We're watching that happen in real time here, 3 weeks into the Trump administration.
Right, and you mentioned Trump. We have a new Department of Energy secretary coming on board, Rick Perry, former governor of Texas and presidential candidate himself. What is your? Have you looked into Mr. Perry's? From what I understand, he didn't even know what the Department of Energy did, and I think he did refer to it as something else than it was, and couldn't answer a question during the debates about it because he didn't know what it was. Now, a person who didn't know what the Department of Energy was or what its tasks are, what its job is head of it, and a person who's distinctly opposed to regulation in this area, as he's said many times in his career.
Well, I think it's really illustrative that the first thing that happened in the Trump administration relative to Hanford and the Department of Energy was they suspended civil penalties against contractors that retaliate against whistleblowers. So it's like, what?
How did that happen? Was that in a executive order that I missed? How did that occur?
That was just the DOE deciding to suspend it. And, I don't know if Rick Perry was behind that or somebody else in the Trump administration, but that just happened last week.
Who did he get suspended again? He got somebody suspended, you said? I didn't hear that.
No, it was there were some rules that for any contractor who retaliates or fires a whistleblower, then if found guilty of doing that, because that's against the law, then those contractors would be subject to civil penalties. So the DOE would frown on, a contractor firing a whistleblower, right? So they suspended that part of the law. They said, no, we're not going to do that now, and we're going to review this and to see if the industry likes it or not, I guess. And when they say they don't like it, I guess that might become a permanent feature. So, we're moving the wrong direction already. I think it's a precursor of things to come. I sure hope not. And I really don't have an opinion on Mr. Perry because, all the signs are disturbing, but he had good answers in Congress. We'll see if he can deliver on the cleanup and et cetera.
So he says that DOE will stay committed to the cleanup.
He does say that.
Okay, so time will tell. We'll see. Tell us a little bit, just the last few minutes, what are some things folks should know about this place, Hanford, Washington? I think a lot of people really don't know much about it and what they did there. And I wanted to go back to some of the historical stuff we were talking about at the beginning and tell there was 9 reactors that were built. What do those reactors do? What was their purpose? And how do they operate? Can you give us a little bit of that background history?
Sure. Yeah. Well, these were the first reactors ever built. They take uranium that is mined from the earth. And some of that uranium, a very small part, is fissionable, meaning it's uranium-235, and it can react with other uranium. Sure. And that's the basis of a nuclear reactor. Except the other thing that happens is that when that uranium fissions, it creates byproducts and other types of radioactive materials, in other words. And one of those byproducts was and is plutonium. So plutonium did not exist on the planet before in large quantities, or in any quantities really, until man came along in the 1930s and 40s and started playing around with this stuff. And then we decided to manufacture this in large quantities. So they took a lot of uranium, 238, exposed that to neutron bombardment and created some plutonium out of that. Mm-hmm. And then rinse and repeat. And, they managed to create some 70 metric tons of plutonium at the Hanford site. Mm-hmm. That's a guesstimate.
Wow.
And, it
that's
only
enough
takes
to make a lot of bombs. You said 65,000.
Yeah, it takes about 12 pounds to make a bomb, or less, depending on the size of bomb you want. So it doesn't take a lot, and all that plutonium now is a headache, actually. We don't know what to do with it. It's incredibly toxic. It's like millionth of a gram, in your lungs is a death sentence. It lasts a long time. So
very interesting.
Big problem.
Right, so and that's sort of the continuing problem, what to do with all this plutonium. Some people want to bury it. Some people want to mix it with things and turn it into fuel, and a lot of it just sits in pits in the center of Hanford, Washington. Tell us a little bit. Hanford's large, right? It's 500 square miles, something like that?
Yeah, 586 square miles.
Right, and it's near the city of Richland, Washington, right? Richland, Washington, the Tri-Cities, and it's a couple of hundred miles from Seattle.
Right. So, between here and Seattle is a large mountain range. Unfortunately, there's the Columbia River, goes right through the middle of the site. It's the nation's most second powerful river. 160 miles downstream is the ocean. And Hanford's already contaminated that river in the past from past operations with just very, very high levels of radioactivity, contaminating clams and fish and everything else, ducks along the river. Because of emissions from Hanford, from the reactors into the river. Okay, reactors are shut down, so that's stopped, except now there's seeps of contamination going in at various parts along the shoreline, and that includes uranium, tritium, hexafluoride, all kinds of nasty stuff, hexavalent chromium. So it's they're trying to get on top of that, but most of Hanford's radioactivity is still on the site. Albeit there's, 80 square miles of contaminated groundwater. Wow. So it's an amazing mess. It's going to last for generations out of mind. If we don't get it fixed, then we are putting, a huge burden on future generations.
Thank you very much, Tom Carpenter from Hanford Challenge, for joining us on The Torch.
Thank
Appreciate
you for having me.
And we'll have you again. Thank you very much. We're going to keep following the story. And that was Tom Carpenter of Hanford Challenge talking about the challenges faced by America's probably dirtiest nuclear waste dump, maybe the most polluted spot in North America.